Pacific's iconic steam locomotive, number 844, is 74 years old as of 2018, and over these many years of service, technology, regulations, and operational requirements have changed significantly from when the locomotive was new. As a result, many people who follow the UP steam program have noticed changes made to the locomotive over the years. These changes also include the tender, but are often overlooked by rail fans and model railroaders. Locomotive 3985 is no exception, and I will cover that in a separate video in the future. There have been many HO scale versions of 844 by several manufacturers produced in plastic and brass over many decades. In most every case, the locomotives themselves look to be a reasonable copy of the prototype as it existed when the model was originally produced. Unfortunately, that is not the case for the tender, as every manufacturer I am aware of in HO scale has neglected this critical area. The basic shape, cabinets, ladders, front truck, and centipede parts are all very good. However, the equipment, piping, conduits, lights, brackets, handles, etc. are, with very few exceptions, just plain wrong or missing altogether. Even with Athearn's most recent release of 844 in early 2018, the tender still represents the 1950s everywhere you look, other than the newly added fire hose only printed on the fireman's side cabinet. In part 1 of this series, I pointed out many of the details on a prototype tender that you can reference to modify your model tender, regardless of manufacturer or scale. If you have not already viewed this first video, the link is provided in the comments below. With this second part of my Modernized 844 tender series, I will show how I modified my Athearn Genesis tender to actually look like the prototype as of 2017. The first step was completely disassembling the tender. I took the opportunity to upgrade the electronics before working on anything else. My particular model is the first generation produced with the MRC sound decoder, which I previously replaced with a Soundtrack Tsunami. While the Tsunami is a great sound decoder, there are features of the Tsunami 2 that I wanted to have. My previous installation required an additional connector in addition to the factory Athearn 6-pin tender connector. I replaced both connectors with a Soundtrack's 9-pin connector to simplify wiring between the tender and locomotive. To accomplish this, I had to grind away some of the metal frame and drill a new hole for the mounting screw. To make life simple for assembly with the shell, I reused connectors for the rear light and speakers from the previous installation. I also added a Soundtrack's current keeper to the decoder. Next, I moved to the parts that make up the shell. I used 90% isopropyl alcohol and a small paintbrush to strip all of the clear coat I had previously sprayed on, along with all of the silver lettering and factory black paint. When I was satisfied everything was removed, I rinsed the parts with water and set aside to dry. The rear end piece needs some modification before any assembly can take place. The molded in conduit at the top needs to be removed and made flush, and a 3/16 inch hole for the rear light needs to be drilled. As I was removing the molded in details, I determined it would be easier to just wet sand the entire piece using 400 than 800 grit sandpaper. After the rear end was smooth, I drilled a hole for the rear light. Next was to cut a thin section of 7/32 styrene tube and glue it around the hole. Before cutting though, I used a round jeweler's file to increase the inside diameter of the tube to make the LED easier to fit through later on. Before gluing the rear end piece to the main body, I flattened the ladders and reinstalled them. The Athearn ladders bend near the bottom where the end of the ladder is pointed inwards toward the wheels. The prototype ladders are straight the entire length of the ladder. I forgot to mention this in the part 1 video. Before moving on, I modified the clear T1 3/4 LED. I did this by wet sanding the front of the LED with 240 grit sandpaper until the rounded part of the dome was removed. I then switched to 400 grit, then 600, 800, 1000, and finally 2000 grit paper. The final step was to wax and buff. Now the LED body is flat and crystal clear, easily resembling the rear light on the prototype. I glued the front piece to the main body, then secured the speaker housing to the top inside of the body with the factory screw. Next I glued the top insert into place, followed by the small base behind it that was previously removable. I have glued all of these pieces in place because detail parts transition from the rear to the top to the front, and sides to the rear. By gluing these in place, I won't use the Athearn method of securing the front of the body to the frame, and I will cover my alternate method later. Using the pictures I assembled in part 1 of this video, I started replicating detail parts from brass and styrene for the roof of the tender body. A few of the factory Athearn parts were recycled, but most of the parts added are new. Starting with the front half of the tender, some of the highlights include 2 separate toolboxes in the middle with hinges and handles, 2 fuel hoses to connect to a tanker truck, a new fuel hatch, smaller toolbox on the front fireman side, new piping and handles, and lift rings. Moving to the rear of the roof, the factory light and mount were completely removed and replaced with a light fabricated from a clear T1 LED and brass strip. Conduit with brackets and junction box were added along with the pipe for the water level gauge on the rear of the tender. The fireman's side of the tender only had a few things added. The most obvious is the full-length steam pipe and new brass brackets. I wrapped a brass rod with thread to replicate the insulation used on the prototype. The factory molded handles on the side cabinets were ground down and replaced with brass wire. Styrene was used to create the C-shaped steel bracket behind the ladder. This bracket conveniently hides the fact I made all pipes, hoses, and conduit to pass from the side of the tender down to and underneath the frame as 2 separate pieces. The upper piece is secured to the body and the lower piece is secured to the frame. This allows the tender body to be separated from the frame for painting and for any future reason I would need to get access to the decoder, wiring, or speakers. Speaking of the frame and body, I drilled 2 additional holes on the front tabs of the frame. These correspond to holes drilled and tapped on the front and underside of the body. 2 screws will secure the front of the body to the frame from the bottom, rather than the factory method I spoke about earlier. The rear will be secured by the factory screws on the bottom and the screw under the water hatch on top. Moving to the engineer's side, all 6 conduits and pipes of the prototype are replicated instead of just 2 as in the factory Athearn detail parts. 5 of those are seen here on the body representing the train brake pipe, independent brake pipe, MU wiring, lights, and other electrical circuits. Brackets, valves, filters, cabinet handles, and a hook are replicated per the prototype. The rear of the tender is where every manufacturer misses the mark. The new rear light was previously discussed, but other highlights include brackets, grab irons, water fill pipes with drain lines, water car connection pipes with valves, water level pipe with valve and drain line, and an MU connector and mounting box. Now looking at the frame, the major items include the brackets and piping on the engineer's side, the brackets and re-roll frogs on both the engineer's side and the fireman's side, grab irons, bottom part of the steam pipe, and brackets that keep the coupler cut bars from being pulled accidentally. For the re-roll frogs, I use Details West part number RF293 as they are almost a perfect match to the prototype. At this point I have completed painting the entire body black, painted the new detail parts on the frame, painted the appropriate accent colors for valve handles, pipe, and hose ends, and sprayed a coat of clear lacquer on the sides and rear. The rear main light was installed in the body before assembling to the frame using 5 screws as previously mentioned. Here is a view of the 2 new screw locations underneath the tender near the front. Here is a view of the rear of the tender at this point in the build process. While the wheels were previously painted a grimy color, I rubbed in some rust powders to better match photos I took of the prototype. Next, I added decals from Microscale 87-63 Union Pacific steam locomotive set, as well as 2 custom decals I made. Unfortunately, my decals did not blend in well. For the water level decal on the rear, I had to use white decal paper and print a black background so the white lines and characters would show up. This is necessary because inkjet printers do not print white ink. The white lines and characters look fine, but the black background did not match the black of the tender. The same was true with the red lettering on the fireman's side cabinet, so I removed both of the custom decals. After spending several weeks of trying to resolve this issue with no luck, I decided to move on and sprayed another coat of clear lacquer to seal the Microscale decals. The tender was last repainted in 2005. The sides and rear still look pretty shiny after 13 years, but the top sees more wear and tear. I weathered the roof with paints and powders, using photos one of the UP STEAM team members took for me with my camera in October 2016. The tender is directly behind a steam locomotive after all. Hoses and tools get dropped from time to time while the crew is refueling the tender. It is not normally seen by the public, and some items do move around or sway back and forth while rolling down the track. For the remaining hoses on the rear, I glued in Cal Scale 190-492 hose for the airline, painting the valve handle red and the hose end silver. I also used Details West MU-265 hose, but cut out 2 separate sections to replicate the prototype, as those hoses do have space in between them. The green and yellow portions were painted before gluing into the tender with CA. After the glue set, the hoses were painted black and the end silver. The KD number 58 coupler was also painted a rusty color at this time. The last parts to be made and installed are the lower rungs of the rear ladders, which connect to the frame. It was easier to shape the brass strip with the body and frame mated together so the new pieces fit correctly. I used CA to secure these parts and brush painted them black. I also glued the painted rear frogs in place at this time. Other than the 2 missing custom decals and fishing line to represent the semi-clear water level tube on the rear, here is the finished product. As you have seen in both parts of this video, there are many details you can add to your model to replicate the current day prototype. While working on my model, I used over 220 individual pieces of brass, styrene, wire, and castings to represent as many of the missing prototype details I could. While I try to be as accurate as possible, there are a few places I used modeler's license. This occurred mainly because I don't have the prototype to measure, I couldn't see everything I needed to from the pictures I had, or because the physical dimensions of the model were not 100% exact. I hope you have found this series on 844's Modernized Tender useful for inspiring and aiding you in modifying your model to look like it should. Who knows, maybe a manufacturer out there might be inspired as well. Again, the link to part 1 of this video series with numerous prototype photos and notes is in the comment section below. Links to my other projects are listed there as well. Be sure to subscribe to keep up with my latest projects, and thanks for watching.